This is a map of trade winds in EU4. They slightly increase colonial range and boat movement speed in the direction they pointed, making it mildly easier for Portugal to colonize a couple provinces in Africa and grab some provinces in Brazil, while also making North America effectively slightly further away from England or France than they would be if colonial distances were calculated on a purely distance-based system. Overall, they have such a pathetically trivial effect on the game that a maneuver pip on an admiral is enough to overcome the majority of their effects. I'm prepared to bet good money that the vast majority of EU4 players are completely unaware that these trade winds even exist, and for those that do know that trade winds exist, their reaction can be summarized as, huh, neat, and then those trade winds get ignored. So surely, historically, they had no major impact on human civilization as a whole, right? Well, before I subject you to a budget history lesson while complaining about a lack of detail in a video game, the usual stuff would be appreciated. A like on the video would be great if you haven't already, and a subscription would be amazing. 15k subs is an insane goal, but one within sight. With that said, enough self-shilling, let's get back into the video. I need to simplify a lot here, and let's also be clear, if this topic genuinely interests you, you can use this video as the start of your research. Namely, this video is good for, well, entertainment purposes, but don't use this as an academic source. This kind of applies to all YouTube videos, but I want to double make sure here. I may get details wrong, I frequently do. Just read my comments section where I walk around hearting and acknowledging corrections pretty much all the time. With that said, what is a trade wind? What are we looking at here? Well, basically, these winds are the prevalent winds around the planet if we're going to talk about them from a physics point of view. That exists due to, well, the physical properties of living on a planet spinning at stupid speeds, traveling across space. The physics behind this is pretty cool, but not the topic of today's video, and hence I'm going to leave that as an exercise to the reader. One thing that you may notice right away though is they are not constrained to the small geographical area paradox. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself here. And while their addition could be helpful for the rest of the map, I want to focus on an area just south of where they are present, more specifically, because this is the area where I believe they made the greatest impact on our civilization and our development. Namely, why do you think Portugal established a colony in Brazil? After all, according to the Treaty of Tordesillas, the New World was given away to Spain with the exception of Brazil. Why did Portugal ask for this exception and push for it? After all, their trade focus was within India, and Brazil isn't exactly on the way to India if you were to look at it at the map of the world and chart a route without knowing about trade winds. So why sail from Lisbon to Brazil and then across the Atlantic again before going to India? Well, before we get into that, let's look at how ships behave in EU4. They can just kind of vibe in a province, they can sail at a relative whim, and overall honestly behave like they're powered by engines or oars, not powered by sail. And here is our clue: if you were to try and sail from the Ivory Coast into South Africa, into the Cape, you're going to be sailing into the wind. For those unsure how sails work, you can't do that. You want the wind to push you in the direction you're traveling, preferably from behind you, but you can also make do with the wind pointing in different directions. Let's be clear, there's a lot going on within how the wind works, but one thing that should be self-evident is the wind can't push you forward, it can't really pull you. Now again, sailing is complicated, let's be clear, there's a reason that naval tradition is something that takes centuries to build, and part of that is understanding how to, well, use the wind to move the direction you want. Bear in mind again though that winds change, so it's not as easy as putting your sails into one direction, you want to be changing it with how the wind is changing. But this is where trade winds become useful in some respect, because they're significantly more consistent than the local winds that you might be getting. And herein lies the issue. The wind from the Ivory Coast to the Cape is consistently, literally unusable, blowing straight into you. Now, put yourself into the shoes of, well, trying to sail in these conditions in the 15th century. You sit on a boat in the middle of the ocean. For days, for weeks, for months sometimes, eating away your rations, as you hope against hope that your consistently awful wind becomes slightly less consistently awful so that you may get a chance to sail a bit forward and make at least some progress on your journey. Now, I'm not confident in knowing what those men thought of kin and country. But one thing I know for certain, there were no atheists on those boats. But what happens once you reach the Cape? Well, originally when a Portuguese explorer reached it in the 1480s, it was called the Cape of Storms, as when he reached it, there was a big storm, and in fact those conditions around the Cape are known for being quite stormy. However, we don't know it as the Cape of Storms, we know it as the Cape of Good Hope. We have actually a couple conflicting reasons for this rebrand. First of all, we have a common story that it was renamed this to entice settlers to move into the Cape of Good Hope and settle it, by governments from the Dutch to the English. However, another common theory is that, well, once you reached the Cape, you had wind you could work with. A storm is terrible conditions to sailing, but you can sail in a storm, and the general rule is simple there. Once you reached the Cape, your suffering was over. The conditions were bad, but you could sail. The wind was unpredictable, but you could drop your sails and wait for the wind direction to change. Now for sure, it wasn't smooth sailing, but it was sailing. Hence, once you reached the Cape, well, you could have good hope. Hence, the Cape of Good Hope. Now, I'd like to point out that there's a reason that both of these theories, as for the naming of the Good Hope, are compatible with each other, and hence both are given. Sailors referring to an area as the Cape of Good Hope could start making it a colloquial term that could easily be adopted by a government and used for a rebrand for other purposes. But we're getting sidetracked. Even to this day, these trade winds are important. Thankfully not for global trade or anything of that sort, not after we figured out how to replace wind with sticky dinosaur juice. But if you were to look, for example, at, this map of the route for the across the world sailing race from the 1989 to 1990 Whitbread Round the World race, which again is a sailing race, we seem to be avoiding this area of despair, sailing across the Atlantic before crossing it again to sail around the Cape, and would you look at that, on the way back home we also catch the trade winds from the Caribbean back to England. Now, to be clear though, this is somewhat of a cherry-picked year, just to make my example more clear. Let's compare it to, for example, the race under the same name in 2023, which chose a more difficult route that involved being a touch braver, if I would say so myself. But it just goes to show that, again, these routes are doable. The winds are predictably awful, but that doesn't mean they're consistently awful to such an extent that it's impossible. Regardless though, they clearly matter. So how does EU4 portray this? Yeah, no. Where trade winds do exist, and again they exist in a very limited capacity compared to the prevalent winds all around the world, their effect is insanely minimal. And where they don't exist, well, they literally don't exist. This leads to a situation where in most EU4 games you can just sail down an area into a prevalent wind with no issues, leading to ahistorical colonization for one, and frankly a gross misinterpretation of history for another. This would be a wonderful mechanic I'm sure naval enjoyers would unironically love. But, well, it's not present in the game. What we do have in the game, however, is a minimal monument, for lack of a better word, to trade winds existing. But in truth, nothing else. Now, does this matter? Well, at the end of the day, that's not for me to decide. But what I think is important to remember is that yes, EU4 is great for learning about cool history. But because something is in EU4 does not make it gospel or historically accurate to any reasonable extent. Yes, it is important to acknowledge that EU4 is better at teaching history than most other games. Or frankly, it's better at teaching history than most secondary school history lessons at teaching history. But let's not forget that just because EU4 said Memel is a square, Memel became a square in reality. Now, there is some hope for EU5. Project Caesar. Early on, these maps seem to have indicated a far greater importance on trade winds. But we shall see in time when we have the game in front of us on how they are implemented. I'm not going to go into detail here about EU5 trade winds because again, I'm just going to be extrapolating from like 3 maps. I don't think that's anywhere near enough information to work with, considering again, we don't have the game in front of us. So, since it's too early to see how trade winds are implemented, I'm not going to really comment on that, and in truth, a lot more game mechanics are important for the game to, well, be fun and succeed, than how they choose to represent something as obscure as trade winds, even though again, I'm arguing they're not that obscure. Otherwise, I hope you've learned something new today. However, that is all I have time for. A big thank you to all the people that have supported me over at Ko-Fi, with a special thank you to Arcade Solar.